For nearly 2 centuries, societies have weighed the merits of free market capitalism and socialism. Debates continue over which system maximizes prosperity and better promotes human flourishing. Free market capitalism decentralizes economic decisions, giving individuals control over what to produce, how much to charge, and what to buy. Their decisions are informed by market prices, which convey important information about scarcity and consumer value. Proponents contend that capitalism delivers the best economic outcomes by giving individuals incentives to create and produce. Critics, on the other hand, point to the persistence of poverty in market economies and rising inequality as proof that capitalism fails to deliver broad-based prosperity. They maintain that this inequality ultimately gives the rich disproportionate economic and political power. In contrast, socialism grants the government the authority to make most economic decisions. The government chooses how to allocate scarce resources based upon what it determines to be most useful to society as a whole. Proponents argue that socialism ensures society's resources are fairly distributed. Critics claim that socialism fails to give people proper economic incentives to innovate and produce, which ultimately reduces economic opportunities for all. Opponents further argue that socialism's powerful central governments become autocratic and threaten political freedom. So which system is better for humanity? For as long as this question has been asked, the debate all too often devolves into name-calling and emotional arguments that fail to advance the discussion. And yet, it is imperative that we keep asking. The Human Prosperity Project at the Hoover Institution seeks to overcome these preconceptions. It employs analysis of free market capitalism and socialism and its many variants to assess how each system affects human flourishing.
Morning or good afternoon or even good evening, depending on where you're viewing this. Welcome to the Hoover Institution's Human Prosperity Project. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm a research fellow here at the Hoover Institution, as well as a Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Fellow in Journalism. I'd like to welcome you to today's broadcast. The speaker series is based on the scholarly research and commentary written by Hoover Fellows participating in the Human Prosperity Project on socialism and free market capitalism. The overarching goal of this project is to investigate the historical record to assess the consequences for human welfare, individual liberty, and interactions between nations of various economic systems. This project is research-based, with educational and policy-oriented outputs that include long-form essays, short videos, commentary, and, in today's case, speaker series, all of which can be found at hoover.org/Human Prosperity Project. Let me repeat that for you, hoover.org/Human Prosperity Project. As a reminder, we will be taking audience questions, and I encourage you to do so. And it's a very simple thing to do. You just go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type away, and we'll queue it up for our guest, and we'll do our best to get to your question. I'm joined today by 2 Hoover colleagues, Larry Diamond and Elizabeth Economy, who are here with us today to offer macro views on democracy and authoritarianism. Both Larry and Elizabeth have written papers on this topic that are available online. Larry Diamond is a senior fellow here at the Hoover Institution, as well as the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, that is FSI for short in Stanford speak. Larry is also a Bass University Fellow in Undergraduate Education at Stanford. He leads the Hoover Institution's programs on China's global sharp power and on Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific region. At FSI, Larry leads the program on Arab reform and democracy, based at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. Elizabeth Economy is a senior fellow here at the Hoover Institution, a relative newcomer. I believe she started just this fall. She's also a senior fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Liz is an acclaimed author and expert on Chinese domestic and foreign policy. Her book, The Third Revolution, Xi Jinping and the New Chinese State, analyzes the contradictory nature of reform under his rule. Larry and Liz, thanks for coming on today. I know you've both been busy. Larry, I'm not sure which number in the 5 Zoom calls you're doing today this is, but thanks for taking the time. And Liz, you've been traveling all over the country, so thanks ever so much for doing this with us today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Great to be here.
So I've taken the time to read both of your excellent papers, and Liz, let me start by going to you. Your paper includes this quote from Xi Jinping. Let me read it back to you in the audience. Quote, "The banner of socialism with Chinese characteristics is now flying high and proud for all to see, blazing a new trail for other developing countries to achieve modernization. It offers a new option for other countries and nations who want to speed up their development while preserving their independence. And it offers Chinese wisdom and a Chinese approach to solving the problems facing humanity. Question, Liz, is Chinese socialism transferable?
Thanks, Bill. It's great to be part of this Hoover series and to be part of this discussion with you and Larry. So what makes the idea, I think, of a China model and its transferability so interesting is that it first begs the question of what is the China model? You know, at its sort of broadest level, it's basically a form of authoritarian capitalism. You have extensive state or Chinese Communist Party control over political life, including social organizations and the media, the internet, education. And you have an economy where the party does retain strong control over core sectors, but also allows the market to play a role in many other aspects. You can also define it by its institutions, I think the way that Larry does so well in terms of the lack of rule of law or private property rights. And the China models also become known for its priority on the rapid development of state-led infrastructure and special economic zones that offer tax and other incentives for foreign companies for investing. I think when you look at China's engagement with other countries, what you find in practical terms is that the core of the model that it is exporting in essence is state-led infrastructure growth, controlling the media and civil society, and oftentimes some form of grassroots political work, particularly around poverty alleviation. But different countries get different mix of these elements. And so China's transferring different elements of the model in some cases to different countries in different ways. Let me just give you a couple of examples of how this takes place. So in Guangxi province, which is a poor province in the southern part of the country, there's a leadership academy that's training officials primarily from Southeast Asia on how to guide online public opinion, how to alleviate poverty, and how to develop a strong grassroots political presence. Through the Belt and Road, there's clearly an enormous priority on infrastructure development, but also training seminars that are being offered on how to control the internet and do real-time censorship, real-time censorship, do manage civil society and the media. China's developing safe cities, which include all of the surveillance technology that China has at home, and of course, the opportunity to build your entire technology infrastructure with Chinese fiber optic cables, the satellite system, 5G, and e-commerce. And in some countries, we've seen, Huawei engineers have been put to use helping government leaders spy on opposition candidates. And then finally, I think for countries that actually have their own, communist or revolutionary parties, such as in Sudan or Ethiopia, there's Communist Party training, how to build party organizational structure, strengthen ideological work, help develop a propaganda apparatus. The Sudan People's Liberation Movement has sent hundreds of government officials to China to visit the Central Party School and to learn how to do party building and manage public opinion. So there's not really a one-size-fits-all, but I would say there is a clear pattern and determined effort on China's part to educate and train other countries on the China model. And maybe I'll make the last point and not go into this in depth, but if there's time and people are interested, I do think that China's effort to, quote, export its model is a multi-level game. And it plays out, in the United Nations, and it plays out in terms of China using sort of coercive economic strategies to enforce, its political views on other countries as well. So it's not just about this kind of political capacity building that I've described. It really does play out in sort of different forms in different institutions.
Very good. Larry, in your paper, you point out that over the long run, democracy is the best system for delivering human prosperity. You just look at the numbers, 35 or so free nations around the world, vast majority are democracies. The only exception here might be those countries that have natural resources, oil exporting nations. The question is this, Larry, why would a nation choose market authoritarianism over market democracy?
Well, Bill, the question is who is doing the choosing?
Right.
And I can tell you why leaders around the world would choose authoritarianism over democracy. And usually the market forms of authoritarianism are not all that friendly to the market. They often look like either the state capitalism or the crony capitalism that you find in China and other authoritarian regimes. So bear in mind that there's a very strong relationship between democracy and the rule of law. And authoritarian regimes are much more corrupt on average than democratic regimes are. And leaders who want to be predators and extract wealth and property from their population and love power and want to entrench themselves in it have a very strong incentive to have authoritarianism over democracy. So if you look at public opinion around the world, Bill, which I do a lot of, you find some things that are very striking. Number one, look at the poorest region of the world, the countries of sub-Saharan Africa. You would expect these to be the countries most attracted to the China model, because no country in recent decades, no country in history has lifted more people out of poverty more rapidly than the People's Republic of China. And it's certainly one of the historical records in terms of the pace of the percentage pace of poverty reduction within its country. So certainly Africans, Latin Americans, people in less developed Asian countries want the poverty reduction piece of the China model. But if you look at public opinion, they don't want the authoritarianism piece of the China model. And the support for not just the word democracy with all of its kind of social desirability that still lingers on in the world, but rule of law, presidential term limits, media freedom, judicial independence, having an elected parliament rather than a self-appointed executive make the laws. Support for these things is very enduringly high in sub-Saharan Africa, and it persists reasonably well in Latin America and in Asia and in many other parts of the world. And let me just make one other point. I think we're seeing in recent years, we can get into this, and Liz could expand on this at length, that there is a backlash building in terms of global public opinion against the People's Republic of China because of the bullying and strong-arming way that they've thrown their weight around in the Belt and Road Initiative, and the corruption they have introduced, and the tolerance for authoritarianism they have introduced into many of the national systems they're doing business with. So I don't think there's a broad global public opinion appetite for the Chinese political system. I think there's a lot of undemocratic leadership appetite for that system because they don't want to be held accountable by their own people.
Liz, go ahead and build on that.
No, I mean, I think that's right. If you look across the Belt and Road countries, particularly in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, even Central Asia, you find that there are a lot of protests against Chinese Belt and Road investment because of the lack of transparency, because of the environmental implications. And Kenya had a 6-year-long protest and court case because China was going to introduce a coal-fired power plant into a nature reserve. You have people in Kazakhstan protesting the government's, apparent willingness to transfer land to China, long-term leasing of land to China. There are many reasons why populations throughout these Belt and Road countries are not happy with the way that China does business. They want the development, they want infrastructure, they want growth, but China's mode of doing business is not attractive to them. And, and also the labor issue is a huge one because China often brings in its own workers to do these jobs. And so the people at the local level aren't necessarily even benefiting from the infrastructure projects that China's introducing. Then, of course, there's the debt issue. And, in many respects, China's own development process, right? Its own lack of transparency, the fact that its own infrastructure development incurred enormous debt within China, the fact that it paid no attention to the environmental ramifications of its development strategy. All of these things are exactly the way that it's doing business abroad. It's just another way in which it's exporting its model. So the difference is, of course, that for these other countries, their debt is being held by China. It's not being held internally. And that's actually a pretty significant difference.
Larry, two questions I'd like you to get into. One is the question of why private property and property rights are important in democracy. And secondly, I want you to explain what seems a contradiction if the idea that a free society and prosperity go hand in hand. Explain to me Singapore.
Okay, well, let's start with property rights. The danger of any system of government is that it will overawe society and it will become tyrannical. Of course, this is what obsessed our founding constitutional framers.
Right.
And therefore, you need limited government. And of course, our Constitution provides for limited government, both in terms of limiting the power of the government in general with the Bill of Rights and so on, but also in terms of diffusing power in a federal system down to lower levels and not just the center. But it's not enough, Bill, to limit the potential concentration and abuse of power through political, institutional, and legal designs. You need to diffuse the raw material of power, resources, into private hands in order to protect freedom. And so having a strong system of private property goes hand in hand with limited government. And it empowers the civil society by giving a wide panoply of private sector actors the resources to fund organizations and interest groups that can contend for policy, create a pluralistic political system, and limit the ability for tyranny. Singapore is a really interesting case, Bill. I think it is really the only authoritarian country that has achieved a high level of prosperity. It's probably now in per capita income one of the 10 wealthiest countries in the world. And I talk about the Human Development Index. It ranks very high in that as well. It's really the only authoritarian country that has achieved a high level of prosperity without becoming a democracy along the way, like its fellow Asian tigers of Taiwan and Korea, and earlier from the Meiji era to the 1950s and 60s, Japan did. And I think the reason why is twofold. Number one, and I don't think it's replicable, by the way. Number one, it's the unique personality of Lee Kuan Yew, who really put a stamp on that system of discipline, anti-corruption, and this unlikely and difficult to sustain combination of rule of law in the economic realm and strict enforcement of property rights with a lack of full media freedom and a lack of adequate democratic competition. But he instilled this ethic. He built a political party, the People's Action Party, that's been quite dedicated to it. And even though I don't admire its abridgments of media freedom, nor do I think they're necessary to sustain Singapore's prosperity, you've got to admire what they've done in terms of development and economic governance. And the second reason, Bill, is that they do, even though it's not a democracy, they do have at least semi-competitive elections at regular intervals. And the People's Action Party knows it has to stay on its toes, it has to perform, and it has to limit corruption, or else eventually it's going to lose its market share in the political marketplace, and it may fall from power.
Right. Liz, Larry mentioned South Korea and Taiwan, and we know two things about those countries' experiences. Number one, they became democracies, and number two, they became middle-class societies. You look at China, which is undergoing rapid development. It wants to become a rich, even richer society. How does China not become open and free? How does it maintain a stronger rule of law, not end up becoming a democracy? In other words, how do the Chinese leaders prevent this from happening?
Well, I think, their ideal is actually Singapore, minus probably the competitive election part. But they have studied Singapore for decades and have sent, upwards of 20,000 Chinese officials over time to study the Singapore model. And I think that's, their, what they aspire to. I think what they've created, of course, is, a much more comprehensive system of political control than you find in Singapore. And, I think Xi Jinping at this point, he has created a system where the party is really so intrusive in every element of not only the political system, but increasingly in the economic system. So it's not simply enough to have state-owned enterprises, which, Taiwan and South Korea both had, but even in the private enterprises, the Communist Party is becoming much more active in saying that they're going to be responsible for who's hired and who's fired. And so for Xi, I think it's the penetration, through the system, and that control is essential. That's one element of his strategy for preventing any sort of political reform, is you immediately cut off any kind of dissenting perspectives, and you don't allow, the big tech companies, for example, to get too big, right? And you cut them off, as we just saw the other week with the Ant IPO. You stop them in their tracks and you demonstrate who really holds the reins of power. The other thing, and what they've done effectively up until, recently, is you do maintain this very rapid and fairly extraordinary rate of economic growth, and you have performative legitimacy. And so, as long as people believe that their lives are improving, the argument goes, they will continue to support the Communist Party. And then the third potential pillar is nationalism. And I think, we've seen over the COVID pandemic period, when China's economy initially contracted, that it very quickly turned to nationalism as the source of its legitimacy. And so, can China sustain this? Is it going to be just a larger and more controlling version of Singapore? I don't actually think so. And I'll just point out that if you look back to the pre-Xi Jinping era, to 2010, 2011, you really did have a very different political energy within China. You had a very vibrant internet. You had people calling for political reform openly. You had, calls for, environmental protection. You had people hunting down corrupt officials via the internet. Massive protests, 10, 20,000 people, on the streets, mostly peaceful. There was an era of the political reform could happen, however slowly and however haltingly, one step forward, two steps back, right. But that China, in fact, was, the middle class was driving for the same types of political change that have transpired in other countries. They have the same desires: better education, greater voice in their, political future, greater ability to make their own economic decisions. So I think that group, that middle class, and that elite class of entrepreneurs and liberal intellectuals, they're all still there. And we saw them come out in spades in the first month to two of the pandemic, right. When the internet was once again really vibrant and alive with political discourse. And then Xi Jinping shut it down. So I make that point only to say that, what we have now is probably the most authoritarian and repressive Chinese regime that we have seen, since the and that was even radically different, continuous revolution period of Mao Zedong. Right. But that's not to say that there isn't, a strong undercurrent of political discontent and dissent in China. Just because we can't see it doesn't mean that it's not there. Mm-hmm. And institutional power and authority doesn't actually equate with legitimacy, which, is something that Larry certainly knows a ton about.
Yes.
Yeah, I strongly agree with what Liz has just said. And I would go further. I think there's some significant reason to think, particularly as China ages as well. It's got a demographic problem that George Shultz's project at Hoover has been detailing, that it's not going to avoid the middle income trap of kind of leveling off at a middle income level for the nation. We're not talking about becoming a middle income society of prosperous individuals, unless it moves at least in the direction of Singapore toward a greater rule of law, more transparency, more openness, and so on. Because this concentration of power, and people talk about the corruption crackdown under Xi Jinping, but the fusion of the party and the economic system is an original sin of corruption, I would say. And unless you break that by separating the party from the state, and crucially, the party from the judiciary, you're not going to get over this hump. Inequality is going to intensify, as we see now in the countryside, where there's much more massive problems of low education and inadequate healthcare than in the cities. The Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping is a party of fear. And it looks like, at least under Xi, they have doubled down on the authoritarianism option.
Right. A question I'd like both of you to address, Larry and Liz. Larry has written about democratic backsliding in Asia. And this seems very timely, given that just yesterday, the entirety of Hong Kong's elected pro-democracy opposition announced its intention to resign after Beijing passed a resolution giving local authorities just new powers to quash their dissent. We have a new administration coming in next January, and their plate is already full with regards to China, given trade issues, possibility of military escalation. How do you see a Biden administration addressing democracy in addition to these other Chinese concerns?
Well, we know some things from what Biden has already said. He's going to call a democracy summit in the first year of his administration to try and invigorate a broad global, if not alliance, at least network and a sense of common purpose among the world's democracies, and restore the visibility of American leadership among democracies. He's certainly going to work very hard on an urgent basis to restore our transatlantic and trans-Pacific alliances, particularly with the democracies of Europe and Asia, Japan, Korea, Australia, India, and of course the special case of Taiwan. I think that, he's not going to have the bandwidth in the midst of the economic and public health crisis to spend a lot of his personal or political capital on, opening up conflicts with authoritarian regimes around the world. There's going to be an element of pragmatism, I predict, to his foreign policy, but we're going to see, Bill, I think, more leading with values, more expression, at least, of concern about human rights in the world, more presidential expression of concern about Hong Kong, for example, which is very alarming what has happened. And at the same time, I hope the same vigor in confronting China's authoritarian bullying and projection of sharp power that the Trump administration has taken a new and important turn on to push back against.
Liz, you want to add something to that?
Sure. I mean, I agree entirely with what Larry said. I think, one of the weaknesses of the past 4 years, has been the emphasis on just pushing back against Chinese efforts across the board. And I think that Larry's exactly right, that is very important. And we have seen the Trump administration, not the president himself, but others in the Trump administration stand up. We have sanctions in Congress, sanctions against officials in Xinjiang for human rights abuses in Hong Kong. And we've pushed back against, Chinese technology, et cetera. But it's really been a very defensive and reactive policy, as opposed to advancing a positive and proactive narrative of US leadership on the global stage and the importance of values of democracy and markets. And so I think a Biden administration, as Larry suggested, is going to have this, democracy summit. And, the UK had the idea of the D10, Democracy 10. I think it's going to need to reach out further, though, and make the case for countries in Latin America and Southeast Asia and Africa as to why the rules-based order, why market democracy makes sense for them, as opposed to a Chinese system, as opposed to an illiberal order. And I think we're going to have to, make the case and bring them into supply chains and support things like the clean network, working with them. I do think that there's the possibility, that other countries now have become more activated in this discussion as well. I think Europe now views Asia not simply as an economic opportunity, but they have begun to appreciate more that there's a normative battle underway, and that democracy matters and security matters. And then I think, probably to Larry's point as well, we have to be better at home. And I think a Biden administration will be better at home. I think it's very difficult to project strength abroad or propose yourself as a worthy model if you're failing and flailing in that regard at home. And if you don't really represent what originally contributed to make you an admired country, an admired democracy, welcoming the tired and the poor who are yearning to be free, then I think it's very difficult for you to go out and sell democracy in a convincing way.
Okay, we have only about 20 minutes left on this broadcast, so let's go to audience questions if you both are willing. Let me just add that these are the most questions I've seen in any broadcast I have done, so I apologize if we don't get to your question. Maybe we'll have Larry and Liz on another date to do the sequel to this. But first question comes from Stephen. Stephen asks, quote, China has expanded one belt, one road, adding one orbit and one net. It approaches the endeavor in a one-way method. It has an unchecked appetite for global economic domination, but it has no idea how to engender competition to enhance value. There's an unbridled hubris in the CCP that is fostering aggressive action along China's periphery. Has it bitten off more than it could chew? Has it bitten off too much?
Sure. I would say one of the strengths of the Chinese government is the ability to have their programs and projects evolve according to the moment in time. So I think Stephen is right that there is a bit of overreach, certainly in the Belt and Road, especially as you look now at a lot of the African countries calling for debt restructuring, and the Chinese trying to figure out what they're going to do about that and trying to negotiate deals one by one. It's very problematic, and they're getting a lot of pressure, not only bottom up from Africa, but also from advanced market economies, to do things in a transparent way. So I think there's a problem there, but we've also seen that, they've pivoted in some ways. Now they have a health Silk Road and the digital Silk Road, which are advanced more by private actors within China, again, still with Communist Party guidance inside them, but reducing the burden that it places on the government in some ways. And they've opened up their debt market now so that they can get foreign investment in to help them, and so that the Chinese state-owned banks don't have to bear the entire burden of something like the Belt and Road. So I look at them in, for a state-run operation, they can be surprisingly nimble and flexible when it comes to readjusting sort of the levers of their economic diplomacy and figuring out what's working and what's not. I think what Larry referenced earlier in terms of the wolf warrior diplomacy and the ugliness and the bullying is a different issue. And there they've been completely not, sensitive and not very flexible or successful. But at least in terms of trying to adjust what's going on with the Belt and Road, I think I have to say they've done a not bad job. I guess the one last point is that they showed in 2019, they had the second Belt and Road Forum. And, again, a lot of countries were pushing back around the issue of not having a green Belt and Road, against the lack of transparency. And the Chinese have promised to do better. Thus far, they haven't really done better. And I think one way in which a Biden administration could make a difference would be actually to elevate this issue of how China has not lived up to its commitments to do a better job in terms of the governance issues around the Belt and Road, and sort of hold China to the standard that it promised back in 2019. I think that would bring a lot of pressure to bear on Beijing.
Okay, Larry, a question from Andrew. Would some democracies benefit from integrating some aspects of socialism in their system, i.e. healthcare?
I think that socialism is a means of state control over production. You can have European style social democracy and still have a largely capitalist system that is quite consistent with democracy. I have mixed feelings about single payer systems, and I don't think that's where we're headed in the United States. I think if you want to expand healthcare in the United States, taking more people at a lower age into the Medicare system and building on the foundations we have are more practical ways of doing it and more achievable ways. I think we need to worry, about justice and equity if we want to defend and sustain capitalism, which is, I think, a vital foundation for human freedom and prosperity. But we need to be careful here. You don't have to have a purely free market and no government involvement in the healthcare sector in order to still have both a foundation of property and limited government and a high level of prosperity. These are within the boundaries where people debate and countries differ, and you look and kind of pragmatically ask what works. I do want to say, if I can, before we move on, not only do I endorse everything Liz said, I want to add on something about China. I think we need to recognize that China is trying to bite off a tremendous amount. I believe its agenda is to reshape the global system and to dominate it for the 21st century. That is why it's trying to rewrite the rules of the international system on the internet, telecommunications, plant Huawei's 5G system in as many countries as possible. That's why it's preparing to launch a system of of digital currency and electronic payments to eventually replace the US dollar. And we should not assume that the People's Republic of China has bitten off more than it can chew. It will only prove to have done so if we up our game and become more vigilant and more tightly allied as a democratic network of states around the world.
Liz, we have a question from Eric. Where are Xi's major vulnerabilities, and why is he taking the actions he's taking?
So I think his vulnerabilities institutionally are few, in the sense that he has amassed an enormous amount of institutional power in his own hands. He sits on top of most of the important committees and commissions that oversee large areas of policy. He has, increasingly required that people subscribe to the notion that it's not only the Communist Party that you need to be loyal to, it's Xi Jinping himself that you need to be loyal to. So the two have become fused together in a way that we, again, haven't really seen since the high points of the Mao era. He's interviewed all the members of the Central Committee and the second tier of the Central Committee as well, and to make sure that they're loyal to him. I think in 2022, when we have a new standing committee and he'll be reselected as General Secretary of the Communist Party for his third term, he will only strengthen his hold over the standing committee. I think some of the reform-oriented leaders will move out. So I think institutionally, he's quite strong. He has the anti-corruption campaign that he's used to target his political enemies. He's upended the two-term limit on the presidency. It's hard to find a crack in that particular area. But again, I think if you look at the degree to which the creative class, the entrepreneurial class, and I think increasingly the middle class, does not like the direction in which he's moving the country. For Xi, there can never be enough control, right? So he's constantly looking for new ways to exert control, over the political space and over the economic space. And I think, we're seeing, for example, the beginnings of a debate on privacy in China. And I think that's very unexpected for many people. But looking back at the two Congresses in May, Robin Lee, who's the head of Baidu, stepped up and said, I'm not sure, which is kind of the Chinese Google, by the way, for people who don't know, but it stepped up and said, I'm not sure that the Chinese government should have the right to retain the health information that was gathered during the pandemic, that they should be able to keep that. Now, that's an interesting point to be making. And now you've had a couple of lawsuits in China from private citizens around privacy issues. So I think there are areas of vulnerability that, we have to keep our eyes peeled for them, because the signals can be very small. And one last one I do think is important to note for the moment is vulnerability within the top leadership, because I do think that there is a split within the leadership, and that we've seen Li Keqiang on a couple of occasions step up and say things that are pretty different around entrepreneurism, and wanting to have more space for entrepreneurs in China. And then recently, he revealed at the two Congresses that half of the population, 600 million people, live on $140 a day or less. That was a direct swipe at Xi Jinping's effort to claim, all of his success in poverty alleviation. Because while Larry is right, the country has this incredible success story for 40 some years, it still has 600 million people at $140 or less a month. So that to me, those are the really small things that you have to pay attention to see that, even though he has all this institutional control, his political control is not perfect.
Larry, anything you want to add to that?
Well, only that 600 million people in pretty low income and often miserable circumstances in the countryside is not a small number of people.
Right. Okay. Larry, a question from Christian who asked, quote, what are some practical policies the USA and its allies can develop to promote liberty, prosperity, and the rule of law in communist China?
Well, I think we need to relaunch the battle of values and ideas. I've been looking over the participants in our audience here, and at least two of them are friends of mine who spent their careers in the public diplomacy sector when we had a U.S. information service. And I would reconstitute USIA. In fact, I would follow the recommendation of James Clapper and his remarkable memoir and launch a USIA, U.S. Information Agency on steroids, to wage the battle of information and ideas for the 21st century. We've got to counter Russian and Chinese disinformation and authoritarian propaganda. We have to ramp up our broadcasting efforts to do that, not by descending down to their level of information manipulation and lies, but as our, one of the greatest journalists in American history, Edward R. Murrow, said, truth is the best propaganda. And educate people about rival political systems, educate people about the real formulas for national success, educate people about the types of institutions economically and politically that unlock people's innate aspirations for dignity and freedom. And if we do that, Bill, we will win that battle. Now, I'll just say two specific things. We can't do it by knocking China over the head, or playing by their rules. I have been saying for the last several years, and I hope I can persuade a Biden administration to do this, that I'd like to see the United States and other democracies produce about, maybe a couple 100 million thumb drives and put the body of, democratic ideas and values and, the thinking about economic and political freedom from different countries and cultures and historical eras in, about 15 or 20 different languages, but Chinese, Russian, Farsi, and Arabic would be pretty important ones to start with. Put them on a thumb drive and just distribute them around the world. Make them look like lipstick. Make them look like keychains. And then you plug them into your computers and you start educating yourself. This is the kind of way we need to get creative about winning the battle for values and ideas. That's a battle we can win.
So Liz, it sounds like Larry is suggesting that there are ways to get around blocking on the internet and pulling down satellite dishes and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I love what Larry said. I think that's great. I guess at a more prosaic level, I guess I would say it's actually really important that we be the best that we can be as well. And that if we're not, that and everything that we do that Larry has suggested will not resonate in the right way. Because, China does and has in the past looked to the United States. I remember speaking with a young activist, and he told me one of the most important things that he remembers from the Obama administration was the passage of the Gay Marriage Act, right? And what a profound impact that had, for gay activists in China, right? And so when we do things, when we lead in our best way possible, that's what defeats also the Chinese Communist Party. When we're ugly ourselves and when we're bullying ourselves and when we don't protect our institutions from corruption and corrosiveness and we don't handle a pandemic in an effective way, then it's easy for Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party to say, look what's going on over there. What a mess that democracy is. So I think for me, it has to begin at home. We have to be better.
I just want to add, this is why it is another reason why, among the many reasons why, it is so important that we treat Chinese students in the United States, Chinese scholars in the United States, Chinese business people in the United States, and people of Chinese descent in the United States with respect and equality and a warm embrace. We vet them before they come. We monitor the conduct of everybody who's doing sensitive research to make sure they're not violating our laws. But otherwise, we have to suppress any instinct for distrust on the or hostility on the basis of someone's nationality or ethnicity. This is important to being who we are, but as Jennifer Pon will explain in her seminar that we're going to have at Hoover soon, it's also very important for us to winning the hearts and minds of the Chinese students who come to study here, who until recently numbered over 300,000.
Right. And Liz, maybe you can build on that. The two challenges that would seem here. Number one, the challenge of scapegoating as the virus seems to be getting worse at the moment, not better. And then secondly, if travel is limited and interpersonal exchanges are limited, how you can build that better relationship that Larry is talking about.
Right. So yeah, the issue of scapegoating, I mean, I do believe that there needs to be a real inquiry into the origins of the virus. China has to come clean. I also pretty much don't believe that the numbers that they've put out about the cases and deaths. I think it is much higher than they have said initially. I also think they've done a pretty effective job since then in taking control over it. I think the days of our scapegoating them and saying, the China virus stuff, they're way past. They're way past. We now are masters of our own fate, and we have to step up to the plate and do the right thing. And just a pitch for where I am right now, which is New York State. And I have to say that, as Larry was talking about all those questions about balancing between the rights of the individual and, the intrusion of the state and how do you find that these are daily issues that we have to confront. And this pandemic brings that front and center for people in the United States. And, how we find that new balance, I think, is going to determine the future of this pandemic in this country. But that's a somewhat separate issue. Just to say, I think we're no longer in a position of blaming China for this. We've created our own coronavirus state at this point. But there was another part to your question, which now I've
Just the interpersonal relationship, just how
how do we build them, right?
Right.
So look, I'll tell you that via Zoom, you can be meeting and talking and engaging with Chinese morning, noon, and night. And it's a lot easier in some respects to work across the Pacific when you don't have to travel there and travel back. You can, pick up and do a Zoom call with a degree of ease. And I think the beginning of it is going to be the Biden administration and just beginning to rebuild a bilateral framework for discussion and for engagement. That's not to say that I think, we're at any point going to have a grand bargain, or that we actually need to pursue particular, policies to arrive at a grand bargain at this point. I don't think that's in the cards, but I do think we should adopt a somewhat new tone in terms of figuring out, listening to what they're saying and transmitting our own message, because we need to hear from them in order to be able to, push back or to find areas of common purpose or whatever. Having the complete collapse of a bilateral diplomatic framework, I think, is not helpful to our cause.
Right. We have but 2 minutes left. I'm not going to do something that serious academics and professors like you hate. I'm going to ask you for a brief answer to a question that's more fitting a course or a book. And the question comes from Eileen. What would you advise President-elect Biden to do differently in order to protect America's value system?
Well, I think rhetoric is very important, to behave with dignity, to stop embracing dictators with warmth and love. We need correct relations with many of them, not least China. We have a lot of business to do, even with Saudi Arabia. But, to treat our allies as friends and dictators as people who need to have an awareness of universal values that we're going to represent in the world.
Right.
And I would say at home, Bill, to try and transcend our political polarization. We cannot succeed on the global stage to advance and defend freedom if we remain as bitterly divided and tribalistic as we have become at home. And I hope that can begin in this transition period.
Okay, Liz?
That was so beautifully said. I think I can only add, that we do need to open our doors back up again. We are a nation of immigrants, and we need to welcome the best and the brightest and the people who do want to be free and who do want to work hard and make a better life for themselves, and who will contribute to our country and all its greatness. And so I hope we become a more generous nation again.
Well said. Larry, Liz, thanks for your time today and for sharing your thoughts on democracy and authoritarianism, especially how it relates to the competition between socialism and free market capitalism. The next installment of the Human Prosperity Project series, which will close out 2020, by the way, will take place on December the 3rd, the same time as today, 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. Our speakers will be Hoover Senior Fellows Scott Atlas, John Kogan, and Josh Rao, and the topic of their conversation, impacts of government-sponsored programs. Again, you can find the Hoover Institution online and more information on the Human Prosperity Project at the following address. It is hoover.org/Human Prosperity Project. Once again, hoover.org/Human Prosperity Project. Again, thanks for joining us today. On behalf of my colleagues Liz Economy and Larry Diamond, all of us here at the Hoover Institution, have a happy Thanksgiving. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll do our best here at the Hoover Institution to help you stay informed. We'll see you in December.